Hi everyone, I'm Maggie Parkhurst from Global Upside. Welcome to today's virtual open house. Our panelists will begin by addressing the top HR, payroll, and finance considerations in Brazil and conclude with a question and answer session. Please enter your questions via the chat window located at the bottom of your screen at any time. We will answer these in the order that they're received. If we're unable to address all questions during our live session, we will respond to you individually via email. These questions and answers are intended to be used for informational and guidance purposes only, not as legal advice. First up, I'd like to introduce our CEO, Raghu Bhargava. Raghu is an award-winning entrepreneur who has spent his career helping companies tackle accounting, payroll, HR, and compliance challenges in over 100 countries. Prior to Global Upside, he held leadership positions at several companies, including Deloitte and NetIQ. Our next contributor is Andrew Wilson. Andrew helps some of the world's leading companies tackle complex global HR and payroll challenges. Prior to Global Upside, Andrew worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Oracle, and also consulted for companies like Nestle, P&G, and Pepsi Cola. Also on our panel is Nathan North, Director of Global Payroll. Nathan helps our clients develop robust payroll processes, systems, policies, and programs. Prior to Global Upside, Nathan managed global payroll for leading employers, including Netflix. Now over to you.
Thanks, Maggie. So before we get into the Q&A session and answer specific questions that we've received, we just wanted to set the bar in terms of giving you some basic information about doing business in Brazil, or as we call it, key considerations. So the first one among them is the legal entity setup, and you really have two choices. You can set up as a branch, or you can set up as a subsidiary of the foreign company. And the subsidiary, if you do that, then it's just called LTDA or Limitada, which is Portuguese for limited. And the branch obviously has the exposure that the parent company is liable for all liabilities, if any, that are unresolved. Subsidiary limits your risk. The second thing to think about is hiring. So on contrast to countries like UK, you cannot stop people from working, or they have the right to work concept, where you cannot put them on, so to speak, a garden leave, or you can not restrict them from going to work for a competitor, and because they have the right to go work to get meaningful employment. Company law compliance is a very big deal in Brazil. There's a lot of requirements. I'll talk about some of those, but from a resident director perspective, they need a resident director for the parent company of the subsidiary and one for the subsidiary. They also need what is called Brazilian society administrators, one for the parent and one for the subsidiary. So you need 4 roles filled. Now, these roles can be filled by the same individual, but that individual has to be a resident of Brazil and living there. And so, that's something that you need to think about, how you're going to fill those, and do you have adequately senior enough people to fill those roles, or do you need to hire somebody from the outside, a professional director? Accounting is another complicated requirement. Just like any country, there's obviously record-keeping requirements, but Brazil requires that record-keeping to be done locally. And then everything has to be done in the Brazilian system, because the system has to communicate with the government's system for processing invoices from vendors and issuing invoices to customers. And this is all around the bribery and tax evasion issues that the government is trying to get a hold on, so that everything goes through the central system, and then the government can reconcile it with the returns and information that you have to provide on a monthly, quarterly, or annual basis. And that's the compliance and tax piece. So there's obviously a lot of compliance around reporting down to the transaction level and things like that, uploading your trial balances and stuff to the government's website. And Brazil is a country with as many as 90 different types of taxes that you're subject to, from the federal, provincial, county, and city levels. And depending on where the goods services are manufactured, produced, shipped through, and stored, warehouse, you can be subject to many taxes. In some cases, that can double the cost of your product just by taxation. So you have to know and understand those, and you have to then make sure that you're doing the proper filings on a regular basis to stay in compliance. A little bit more on the employment side. So, to employ people, you can obviously hire somebody as a contractor. We don't recommend doing it other than if it's for a very finite scope of work for a very limited time. So just a few weeks, you need some special expertise, then it's okay to hire a contractor. Otherwise, the rules are very similar to most other countries where you have a 20-point checklist. Does this person look more like an employee or a contractor? And depending on the outcome, you may have to worry about it. Yes, if you have a small presence, then the PEO or employer of record is an option. And that is becoming very popular in Brazil just because of the compliance requirements and the cost of doing business. For example, the resident directors, that you end up doing a PEO. And obviously, forming your own subsidiary to employ your team, that's always an option. Employment contracts. So even though employment in Brazil is at will, just like in the US, they still have to sign an employment contract, which is bilingual. And remember, in Brazil, they speak Portuguese, not Spanish. It's the only Portuguese speaking country in the Americas. But you have to sign a contract with these employees that govern a lot of the T's and C's. And then, as an example, the termination for cause is covered by general employment law. So it specifies why and how you can terminate somebody for cause. But other than that, a lot of the T's and C's are governed by the employment contract. And these employment contracts obviously provide termination protection for both the employee and the employer, and the consequences of breach. From a benefits perspective, yes, it's a socialist country, so you have statutory requirements for many benefits. There's obviously supplementary benefits that, to make the pot a little sweeter, you may provide. And then there's customary benefits depending on what industry and the geography you're working in. So in some of the smaller geographies, you may have lesser benefits. In the major metropolitan of Rio or Sao Paulo, your customary benefits might be a little bit more. For example, commuter benefits might come into play. Payroll, again, very typical payroll issues in terms of computation, taxes, payroll reporting, things like that. There are other complexities in payroll. For example, you cannot hire anybody without a medical exam. And once they get hired, they have to go through a medical exam again. So those are whether you think about payroll or the hire to retire cycles, those are issues that you need to worry about when recruiting, hiring in Brazil. And then you also have to think about, from a hire to retire perspective, how do you find the right workforce? How do you find the right talent? How do you then bring them on your payroll in terms of the recruiting cycles, the hiring, onboarding cycles, and how do you maintain that global workforce visibility irrespective of the headcount? And keep in mind that all of these have other requirements in terms of record keeping and stuff, so that if you wanted to actually terminate somebody or do a layoff, bigger layoff, you need to go to the labor court and present them hard copy evidence of every relationship that you had with that employee life to date and build your argument on that. So there are major requirements in terms of not just accounting, but also HR, record keeping, and stuff from a local perspective. With that, we're going to turn it over for Q&A.
Thank you, Raghu. Here is the first question that came in. How to use a PEO in Brazil?
So I'll take that, Maggie. So obviously, a professional employment organization is acting as the employer of record on your behalf. They will have a legal entity that is in compliance from a corporate law and an employment law standpoint. The limitation, obviously, employing people on your behalf is that the legal entity has to be subject to a collective bargaining agreement that it has chosen to be part of that company in terms of the industry that's specific to. So that can create problems in terms of hiring people on your behalf, because obviously it's a situation where their skill sets and classifications might fit into it, and they may object to being classified under that. However, from the perspective, obviously, they can employ the person, they can pay the payroll taxes and statutory benefits, they can do the hire to retire functions, but be mindful of the fact that it is very industry specific, and it may not be specific to the type of work that you're asking them to do.
Great, thank you. Next question. What are the key laws/regulations, the material differences in Brazil versus US?
So I think Ragu's already touched upon the situation as it relates to the way that, because of the money laundering and the tax evasion, that the government is trying to crack down in terms of tracking everything in terms of the amount of tax collected and the tax paid, and really from a foreign company standpoint, acting in that jurisdiction, it is very onerous to be able to maintain those records and be able to do the reporting on a timely basis. And there are penalties and interest to bear in mind if you do not meet their requirements and you're not reporting on a regular basis. Also, from the perspective of the personnel records, there, as Ragu commented, then there is onerous requirements there. Now, Brazil is an at-will country in terms of the employment. However, it is recommended to have the employment agreements in place. And I think it's also to bear in mind that although it's at-will employment, there's a lot of government regulations as it relates to that, because what you are saying is that it's very specific. It's defined by the law for termination with cause, because it has to fit the general categories that it's into. If there is termination without cause, it's very specific in terms of the compensation entitlement. There are rules that differ for employees that are employed before 1988 and after 1988. There is a fund that you have to pay into to basically make sure that termination without cause is funded correctly. And then I think in all cases, if it's an individual termination, that does differ from a workforce reduction. If you are really talking about having to do a mass layoff, then usually the courts will defer to the union in terms of negotiating with you the arrangements and the compensation that is due for a large-scale layoff as it relates to your company.
Great, thank you.
And additionally, for payroll, just a few key points is one, like Ragu previously mentioned, you have the medical exams that are required. You also have the 13th month payroll paid out at the end of the year, and you also have the 1 month vacation after 1 year of employment has been completed.
Great, thank you, Nathan. Next question is, can you address the requirements to pay for employees' commute and lunches?
Maggie, I'll address that question. So in order for the company to be in compliance and understanding if they need to pay the employees for either lunch or meal tickets, commuting vouchers, it all depends and relies on the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement. So once a company is assigned the CBA, then the CBA will stipulate what items that the employer must procure for the employees.
Great, thank you. What is the process for dismissal?
So as we previously discussed, in terms of termination for cause, there are 12 specific examples of termination for cause in the government regulations that you have to fit into to be able to qualify for that. Obviously, it is a government regulation. It's open to interpretation. So even though you may have the documentation to support that, and it may appear very cut and dry to you in terms of the termination for cause, the employee obviously will be in a situation where their interpretation, they can take you to court, they can subject you to a long dispute process, and you may end up losing with any situation where you go through the courts. In terms of the termination for without cause, the 2017 labor law changes did allow the concept of a mutual agreement to end employment, which allows you to negotiate more in terms of the overall provisions that are being terminated. Otherwise, as we discussed, there is the government fund where you pay into, and then if you do terminate without cause, you are required to make additional contributions. I believe it's 40% of the person's annual compensation to make sure that the fund can cover their payout in terms of what they're entitled to. As we talked about workforce reductions, then it's obviously a totally different situation, and that's very much subject to the union negotiations.
Great. Okay, I think you touched on this a little bit, but what severances do in case of dismissal not for cause?
So yeah, as I said, the guaranteed fund for the length of service, you are paying into the fund, obviously, as part of the normal payroll process and the contributions. But if you do terminate without cause, then you are required to pay 40% of the total funds accumulated as it relates to the employee, and then you have to pay a fine equal to another 10% to make sure that everything is covered in terms of what their severance payments would be. So again, terminating clause, there's very specific provisions in terms of what you're doing. Now, workers prior to 1988 are governed by different rules, and there's different examples in terms of what they're entitled to. And they do accumulate on the basis of length of service and payments associated with that. So it is a different case. It'll be too long to go into here.
One item that I might add for the severance calculation is to be sure that you're sending a notice to the union and also checking the CBA to see if there are additional elements that must be included in the severance based on your CBA.
Okay, thank you. What is involved when closing a business?
So typically, closing a business is extremely hard in any country because what you have to do is, as a step one, you have to settle all your liabilities. You cannot have any liabilities, whether you negotiate and pay them or have the vendor forgive them, whatever that might be. You have to settle all your liabilities and convert all your assets into cash. So all you have is a bank account left with money in it. And then you have to go file all your tax returns, you have to get all your audits done, and get clearance certificates from the taxation authorities that you don't owe any tax to anybody. And then once you have all of that, you have a process of publishing in the local gazette or the local paper to let the public know at large that, we're shutting this company down and stuff, so that, if somebody, may come out of the woodworks to claim some liabilities that you owe them, and things like that. And then once you have that period of time pass and things like that, that's when you can apply, and the court will review a lot of your documents to make sure that you have the proper documentation, you have the right clearances, that you did it advertised properly based on the requirements and stuff, and that's when it allows you to shut it down. That process can take typically much longer than setup process, and can go on for as long as 2 years or sometimes even longer, depending on how long you've been in business and how complicated you were and whatnot. So it is not something that you want to really explore just because this is something you have to think about a lot.
Great, thank you. What are unique items to consider when thinking about setting up an operation?
We just talked about closing a business, but now we come back to the opening of the business. And I touched a little bit on this. For example, the resident director requirements, the registered office requirements, things like that. How are you setting up how do you want to limit your liability? Do you have the right contracts drafted? Do you have the right legal advice in terms of employment contracts and stuff? But even more importantly, in Brazil, there are a lot of licensing requirements around your industry and stuff. So if you are a life sciences type company, you can't, just because you incorporate, set up a subsidiary, that kind of stuff, doesn't mean you can be in business. You have to get specific licenses from the government, and they have a hearing process and stuff that can take 9 to 12 months to get your license going. So, and even if you are just a retailer or your goods are sold at the retail level, you kind of have to think about if you're going to manufacture your goods elsewhere outside of Brazil, how do you bring them in? Who's the importer of record? How do you buy and sell that from that importer of record and stuff? And so there's a lot of complexities on setting up an operation in Brazil, and I would recommend consulting with somebody, whether it's Global Upside or somebody like us.
Thank you. Next question, are options tax exercise or issuance?
So in regards to options being taxed at exercise or issuance, the options are subject to taxation, requires a case-by-case analysis. In Brazil, you have your option plan could be under a commercial contract or be directly a part of a participant's compensation. If your options are part of a participant's compensation, then based off of most recent case law in the Brazilian courts, if the plan is deemed to be part of the participant's compensation, then yes, tax and social security implications may arise at the exercise of the option. And this is an item that is fluid based off of Brazilian court case law. So I would definitely stay up to date on this topic in general.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. Can we have someone work in Brazil for 2 to 3 weeks?
I'll take that one, Maggie. I think as in any country, it really isn't. The government looks upon sort of coming into the country on a tourist visa for a short period of time to fulfill a meeting, or as it relates to a specific company, is not frowned upon. Obviously, if it's an extended period of time, but I think just as you would in the U.S., I think you would they would turn a blind eye to when they think of that nature.
Great. What are the benefits, dangers, considerations in this country?
Yeah, so Brazil is a country with, as we all know from the news, political turmoil, where even at the highest level there is the allegation of corruption and stuff. So the prime minister, president can go to prison for that, possibly. So, when that happens, then you know that compliance with FCPA can be a problem. And FCPA doesn't just apply to U.S. company in the U.S., it applies to global operations. So you have to be very careful about bribery, and there's the UK anti-bribery laws. So you have to be very careful about dealings in Brazil. There's a lot of compliance requirements, as we have mentioned many times, which means there's a probability of tripping something because you forgot to file one particular return or report some statistical information that was required. And there's a lot of information that is required, some on a monthly basis, some that you have provided on a monthly basis, you have to re-provide on a quarterly or an annual basis. So for example, your taxes, income taxes are filed on a monthly basis, but you also have an annual requirement to file a tax return. Dangers can come to you in many respects, from theft and kidnapping, and if you end up in the wrong neighborhoods in some of these very, very large metropolis where there are unsafe areas and stuff. Obviously benefits. It's the largest country in South America. It's a huge economy. It's growing rapidly. It's continuing to do well. But so there's both sides to it.
Okay. Great, thank you. So it looks like we're out of time. So any other questions that were asked during the presentation or before will be answered via email. You can also reach out to the panelists individually. Their emails are shown on the screen. And thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.